I've had a few people on the show come on and discuss inflation, and there's never a consistent definition of what causes it. Some people say it's like when I had Jeff Snyder on, he said, well, a lot of the inflation is the increase in prices we're seeing following COVID. We had a supply shock, and that would lead to the increase in prices. A lot of Bitcoiners talk about the debasement of the currency. Stephanie came to him and say, well, you can increase the money supply. It doesn't always lead to inflation. What is your position on this?
So first of all, the MMT stuff is like a bait and switch.
Okay.
Like, if we're talking about long-term, the answer is actually really simple. It's just excess money growth. The money supply is growing faster than money demand. And so prices are going to go up. The reason I say like the MMT thing is kind of a bait and switch is that, there are times when you can increase the money supply without generating a lot of price inflation. But that's generally because like there's elevated like money demand. And they even give examples where they say things like, well, imagine you decided to, imagine the government created this program to buy every child in the United States a pony, and they were going to do so by just printing up money and buying ponies. And they would say, well, the constraint here is that, it is the number of ponies. Well, yeah, what that means is like there's a resource constraint in the economy, and that's what the quantity theory of money says. And so the quantity theory of money just says, like if you are, if you're growing the money supply faster than money demand, you get inflation. So it's just a different way of saying that. And it's this sort of bait and switch where it's kind of like, oh, we don't have to worry about the debt. We can pay for it with money creation. And well, won't that cause inflation? Well, not necessarily. Well, the evidence is pretty clear here on money growth and inflation. If you look at, if you just take like the average of money growth and inflation over the last like 50 years for every, every country for which data is available, and then you just like plot those against each other, I mean, it's going to be pretty close to the 45-degree line on that graph. So what that means is there's close to a 1-to-1 relationship between money growth and inflation. So the idea that we can just print money and it's costless to do so, I mean, there are certain instances where you can do that. Like in a recession, when people are sort of hoarding money, if you're increasing the money supply, it's not really going to lead to higher prices because people want to hold more money. So that extra money that's out there in circulation actually just facilitates people's ability to hold additional money balances. But I mean, it's not hard to think about just basic thought experiments that demonstrate that that's wrong. I mean, if the president came out tomorrow and said, we're going to redenominate the currency and $1 is now going to be $10 and $5 is now going to be $50 and et cetera, right? If they just added a zero onto every denomination of the currency, prices would just go up by a factor of 10. I mean, that's, this is just it's a nominal unit, right? So if you increase, if you just add a zero onto everything, then all the prices would go up by a factor of 10. And so when you're increasing the money supply, you're doing something like that, just on a smaller scale.
But that flaw in MMT seems really obvious. Well, why do you think it's gained such like popularity?
I mean, I don't know why it's popular. It's popular on the internet. It's not popular like in the economics profession.
But Stephanie Kelton was working. Yeah. Was it? No, it wasn't Andrew Yang. Was it Bernie Sanders she was working with?
Yeah, Bernie Sanders. Yeah.
So like they're obviously taking it quite seriously.
Well, Bernie Sanders is taking it seriously, but Bernie Sanders also like this is. I mean, I don't know because this gets to motivation, so I can't speak to people's motivations. But if you want to dramatically expand the size of the government and people are complaining about how much debt that there is, if you have somebody who comes along and says, well, actually, we could pay for it with money creation with very little cost, it seems to me that like that might be somebody that you might be attracted to as an advisor, even if that's not realistic.
Bernie Sanders likes giving away things for free. It doesn't surprise me he wants to give money away for free. Yeah. We had a chap on the show before called Ovik Roy. Do you know him?
I don't.
So he works for a think tank in Austin called FreeOp. Was it something for economic opportunity? Blah blah blah. Daddy will look it up.
The Foundation of Research of Equal Opportunity.
Yeah. They did a study on inflation, and the study highlighted how inflation increases the wealth gap. And he said even at very little inflation, even at, I don't know, 0.1% or whatever the number was, he said it still has a catastrophic effect on the poorest in society. At the same time, I was taught that deflation is bad. Deflation is terrible because people hoard money and they don't spend. Is that true? Have we been gaslighted with that?
So it depends on what's causing deflation.
Okay.
So there's kind of two different causes. One cause is, like this kind of, like the Milton Friedman, Anna Schwartz story of the Great Depression was essentially that you had this, you had these bank failures that was increasing money demand, but that money demand wasn't being met with an increase in the money supply. And so that led to like more hoarding of money and deflation and things like that. So there's also an alternative kind of theory of the Depression, which is more focused on like the gold market. And it was the idea that all of these countries tried to go back on the gold standard, but the United States had most of the gold. And so there was so at first, in the 1920s, sort of as England and then France tried to accumulate more gold, like gold was flowing out of the United States and into and into Britain and then into France. And the basic idea here is that under a gold standard, like the supply and demand for gold determines the price level, right? Because the nominal price of gold is fixed everywhere. So all other prices have to adjust to whatever's going on in the gold market. So if you have this massive global increase in the demand for gold, you would experience deflation. But you could potentially, you could have potentially mitigated this by just allowing the distribution of that gold to change. So if the United States had allowed gold to flow out more to England and France, and actually for most of the 1920s, this is what happened. The United States and Britain sort of allowed gold to flow out initially into Britain and then into France. And but the French had, a ridiculously high like reserve ratio that was imposed on their gold by their government. And also then the United States started to see stock prices going up, and the Federal Reserve got concerned that their policies were causing like a stock market bubble. And so what they started doing is the United States increased its demand for gold. France continued to increase its demand for gold. And then, the British for some time kind of tried to accommodate this. And then at a certain point, they were like, okay, we can't accommodate it anymore. But the U.S. also wasn't willing to change their stance. And so then what you ended up with is you ended up with this like dramatic period of deflation as everybody's trying to get more gold. But so regardless of whether you believe the kind of gold version of the story or whether you believe the kind of Milton Friedman, Anna Schwartz story of the Depression, the basic idea is that this deflation is harmful. But it's essentially harmful because there's excess demand for money that, and in the case of gold, like it can't be met, right? And in the case of, just bank deposits and things like that, it can't be met because the Federal Reserve wasn't, increasing the amount of reserves that they were giving to banks and things. So either story, that sort of deflation is incredibly harmful. And it's incredibly harmful because it's a monetary problem. It can't, and it's an aggregate problem. But deflation is not always and everywhere bad. So if you live in a growing economy, that's going to tend to put downward pressure on prices, all else equal. And so under the gold standard, the reason that you had relatively constant prices over time is that the economy is growing at, say, 3%. And so on average, the supply of gold is growing at 3%. But then the demand for gold is also growing at about 3% because people have more income. They want to hold more money. And so what that does is supply is growing by 3%, demand's growing by 3%, prices are going to stay relatively constant. Now, gold didn't always grow at the same rate as the economy. And so if you're going through a period of high productivity, that means that like these other industries are growing faster than the supply of gold, in which case you would have deflation. And in the United States, we had that in the late 1800s, and it was not painful at all. It was actually, there are actually benefits to that kind of process. So, long-term modest deflation is fine. Policy-induced deflation is very bad.
So, as a Bitcoiner, we're still in this kind of world where sometimes where you meet people and they say, "Oh, what do you do?" I say, "I've got a Bitcoin podcast." I'm like sometimes a little bit embarrassed saying the Bitcoin. I even sometimes say I do. I have an economics podcast. We look at economics through the lens of Bitcoin, but it's still it's gone from being something that is just used by nerds to actually being considered a commodity by some people. It's used as money. Within Bitcoin circles, it's taken very seriously, but outside eyes can still be very dismissive. Certainly people within the economics field. So I'm always interested when there's somebody who's an economist who likes Bitcoin or is interested in Bitcoin. Like a very obviously basic first question, like how did you discover Bitcoin and how many touch points did you dismiss it immediately like some of us?
So, I discovered it very early. I found out about it in April 2011. So I heard a podcast about it, and they were talking about how it worked and what it was, and the podcast was actually with Gavin Hendrickson, and he was just talking about how it works and what the goals were and that sort of thing, and then. It sounded interesting to me, and it sounded interesting to me because at the time I had just finished graduate school. And one of the things that I was really interested in was this literature on like monetary alternatives, like free banking and things like that. And so what I ended up finding out as I kind of looked more into Bitcoin is that the guys that I was reading who were working on free banking and things like that were being cited by Hal Finney on like the Bitcoin forums and things like that. So I think there's a famous post. So one of the guys that I had read on free banking is George Selgin, and Finney had this post on the forums where somebody was saying, how is this going to scale? You can't just have 21 million coins. Like it's not going to be enough. Like you're going to have to, like it would have to scale. How can you have $1 trillion economy and 21 million coins or something? And Finney's response was essentially like a reference to Selgin's book, like, well, this is just like free banking under the gold standard, and referenced Selgin's book. And so that sort of piqued my interest, and I kind of realized that like there was more to this than just some kind of like technological innovation. And so as I kind of dug into it, I found out about, the cypherpunks and what their goals were and what they were trying to achieve and how long they had been like, thinking about this topic. And then that kind of convinced me that, okay, like they're thinking about the same things that I'm thinking about. They've been trying to solve this problem for a long time. Like this is really interesting. And so I just kind of was interested ever since.
So interesting, we covered free banking on the show. My friend Nick Carter wrote a paper or an article for, was it Bitcoin Magazine, about free banking. So that is something, as an economist, you're a proponent of? You believe in free banking? We should have free banking?
Yeah, I mean, I think like I don't think it's a radical idea to think that we should have, so we're economists, and so there's this weird thing with economists, right? Like we always talk about, monopoly is bad. Competition is good. But then when it comes to money, we're like, oh, no, just the Federal Reserve can do the money. And so to me, I was just naturally interested in this question. Like, what is special about money that would make us think that we want to have a central bank, or that we have to have a central bank that controls the money supply? And, and so that just got me really interested in, thinking about competitive alternatives.
Well, isn't it a case of whoever controls the monopoly is a supporter of the monopoly? So if governments control the monopoly of money, it's obviously within their best interest to have that monopoly. But a free market for money would limit the things that government can do.
Well, but I think too, like the thing is though, is I think it's understandable why the government wants it. But my question is why did economists seem to think that this was the one thing in the economy that shouldn't be subject to competition?
Is it because they like the idea of economic theory around how central banks set interest rates? And
I actually think it's a complete misreading of monetary and financial history.
oh wow, okay, let's go.
I mean, you'll hear people make comments all the time where they say, well, of course we have to have a central bank. Look at all the banking failures that we had, in the United States. And so when you look at it from that perspective, like that makes a lot of sense, right? You say, well, there have been a lot of banking panics. There's a lot of banking failures. And so clearly like having some central bank that could be lender of last resort maybe could solve, maybe not all of these problems, but some of these problems.
Another insurance.
And but the problem is that this is a complete misreading of history. Like one of the reasons why we had so many bank failures in the United States is that there were restrictions on note issuance. So you literally have problems at banks during like harvest time when farmers need more money because the bank can't print more banknotes to give them during this time. And so in other words, there's seasonal fluctuations in the demand for banknotes, but banks couldn't always meet them because of regulations that were put on these banks. And also I think I think when they make this argument, they completely ignore like why these central banks were created. I mean, the Bank of England wasn't created so that they could micromanage interest rates in the British economy.
It's for war, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was created because they wanted, because they had just had the Glorious Revolution. They needed to, they had a lot of debt. There were these Jacobite uprisings. France was, supporting the old king. They wanted to go to war. And a new king needed to raise money, but he didn't really have a constituency to raise money from. And it was going to be hard for him to issue debt because, what used to happen in these scenarios is like, a king would get deposed, and what does the new king do? He says, remember the debt that the old king issued? Well, we're not going to honor that because that was his debt. That's not my debt. And so if you are an investor and the king is trying to borrow money, why do you want to lend money to a king that might not last, whose opponent has the support of the French? So they came up with this scheme to consolidate government debt at a lower interest rate by agreeing to charter the Bank of England in exchange for them consolidating the debt and at a lower interest rate.
So are you one of these supporters of the end of the Fed idea? And is it even possible?
It's, to me, I don't even talk about it because I don't even think that I don't even think that it's feasible at this point. I mean, like if you were trying to get rid of a central bank, it would be much better to try to allow greater competition. Because I don't, barring some catastrophic failure, I don't think central banks are going anywhere.